And welcome back. We are now moving on to our feature discussion, and as always, we're mixing up a little bit. And this week we are doing a feature called Alternate Gaming History. And the topic this week is, did 3D happen too soon? So what we're doing is for this feature, we're looking at a different point in video game history and ask, what if something was done a bit differently? And this time we're asking whether or not 3D gaming happened too soon. Should the big three, Sega, Sony, and Nintendo, focus their consoles on 2D gaming at the time? Or were they right in pushing the 3D graphics on their home systems when they did? And just a reminder, the SEGA Saturn launched in November 1994 in Japan. Sony PlayStation was December 1994, and Nintendo 64 was a couple of years later, June 1996. But at the time, those were the three big consoles of the time. Yeah, Chris's favourite date in the calendar. But also a reminder, before the big three, which we think about when we talk about 3D gaming, there was the Philips CDI, which originally launched back in 1990. There was an updated version released in 1991 and some other updated versions after that. There was a Panasonic 3DO in 1993. Chris's powerhouse there. And of course, the Atari Jaguar claimed to be the first 64-bit console in 1993, although there's controversy around that because it wasn't really 64-bit, but let's scrape over that for now. But so yeah, there were in fact 6 consoles in the early 90s which did start to dabble with 3D graphics, but arguably the Saturn, the PlayStation, and the N64 were the ones that really drove it home and were really pushing for the 3D visuals. So yeah, is it? It's. I guess as part of the introduction, it's clear that when you go back now to play some of those games, the 3D visuals don't hold up so well. And there are some games that are almost unplayable now when you actually play them. Even back in the day when they were launched, some 3D games really were pushing the power of those systems, or the developers didn't really know how to handle it. So they're actually quite unplayable even back in the day. They didn't really run very well for the systems they were designed for. So that really does raise the question, were the console manufacturers right to jump on 3D, or did they do it too soon? So Chris, why don't you take it away, buddy?
I absolutely think that they jumped on this too soon. I think the early and mid 90s, the parts that they were using to put in these systems, they just weren't capable of pushing these 3D games. Like if you look on the PC games this era, like the PCs could do that because, they were able to still be, a lot, faster and everything. So you'd have good 3D games on the PC, but when you try to have these console games running on there that were similar, a lot of times they just played like crap, and these games just don't really hold up that well when you go back and play them these days. You can look at, and I think that they should have just stuck with 2D like for the rest of this generation, because I would have loved to seen like what the industry could have done with more 2D gaming and taking 2D gaming and putting it on these, for what they were at the time in the console space. Like these were the most powerful systems that we've ever had for home console. And I think seeing like how they could have really pushed 2D gaming in that time frame would have been awesome, especially if you look back at like the best 2D games of this era. And some of the best looking ones, like Symphony of the Night is one that I think most people would really kind of look at. That game still looks great today. It still looks so good. And I think it holds up a lot better than some of the other games that had come out in this era. So I definitely think that the console manufacturers just jumped the gun on this. I think that they thought 3D was all the rage, and they wanted to show that their system is the one to get if you want real, true 3D, gameplay action or whatever. I just think that they missed the mark on this, and these systems just weren't ready. And I'll even go one step more and say that I don't think a home console was ready for true 3D gaming until the Dreamcast. Ooh. I think the Dreamcast was the first one in '99 that was able to do it right. Because I mean, look with like Sonic Adventure, you can say what you will about that game, but I think it really did 3D gaming really well. And I think the other games on that system, like, you know, NFL 2K, all the visual concept sports games were top notch. And you just didn't really see that from a lot of the other, 3D games that came before the Dreamcast. So I'll go on record saying Dreamcast was the first real true 3D video game console, I think.
Okay, Scotty, do you have a rebuttal for that, or do you agree with what Chris says there?
I think that arcade should have been the baseline, so I'll hop off of that, because they should have paid more attention to... I mean, we were trying to... It's not on lines with the first home console Pac-Man compared to the arcade Pac-Man. Those were very different games. But there is a bug crawling up the wall in front of me. 1 second. So the arcades, when the Saturn and the PS1 were out, and the N64 should have been the baseline. And the Saturn it launched with arcade ports of Daytona, Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop.
Virtua Fighter 1, don't you mean?
Did it? Oh, what am I
Virtua Fighter,
I keep thinking of that triple pack that you got with it if you bought the console later on that had Virtua Fighter 2, Daytona, and Virtua Cop. Yeah, but I feel like they were trying to make they should... let me start that thought over. Honestly, the Dreamcast and the PS2 era was when games were arcade perfect and when polygons were comfortable on home hardware, I felt like. And that was when, like, just look at Soul Calibur, launch game for the Dreamcast, and it had the arcade mode, but so many extra stuff in there. And it still actually holds up today. If you play Soul Calibur 1, it still looks decent. But I feel like consoles should have stayed with maybe the 2.5D stuff more than going into 3D stuff. Like, look at like a Stall or what's that? Oh, crap. Pandemonium.
Okay.
Did you guys ever play that game?
Yeah.
Or Tomba on the PS1.
Clockwork Knight?
What's that?
Clockwork Knight? Don't you ever played that?
Yeah. Because it's got pre-rendered stuff.
That's 2D, but they've got like 3D objects like fall forward and like stuff in the background that comes and anyway.
Yeah, or like Gex. Gex is not a good example of anything. The first one, but like games. Because I was trying to think of games that I love from that era that have not aged well at all. Sonic R is at the top of the list because, like, you look at Knuckles' dreadlocks and they're just straight pieces of paper that drape off of his head. Like, he looks like a demolished umbrella is what his head looks like. Knuckles the demolished umbrella. That's what they call him. And other games that I just love from that era, though, Twisted Metal 1 and 2, Resident Evil, the first two games, or a couple of games in that. Basically, any game where your characters have a face, and hell no, those mouths are not moving when they're talking. But then I was thinking, like, well, Mega Man Legends was later on, and you at least had, like, like different expressions, but not, and the only way they were moving around was like, and there were words going along with them and stuff. That I'm sure that plays real well for audio listeners. But but another one that you think of is, of course, the Panzer Dragoon games, because those I can't recommend enough. Graham, did you ever look at the Panzer Dragoon post-mortem thing from GDC? How they talked about like how those games were made, essentially. I forgot. You should definitely check that out. It's like a good hour, so you might be able to watch it in spurts and stuff. But they talk about how just the models in that game, like each what should have been a pixel or like just a piece of paper, really was like a cube or like a decahedron or something crazy. Like way more effort went into making each small bit of that game than it should have, which is probably also why no one's tried to recreate it. But, even games like Metal Gear Solid, the first Metal Gear, that came out then, but it's hard to look at that game now. Even was it Twin Snakes that got ported to the GameCube, I think. A lot of people say that game is bad, or that version of it or something. I don't really know what's bad about it because I don't know that much about it.
I know they added extra stuff to it, which was just ridiculous. There's a bit where he does like a backflip onto like a missile and like throws it back at someone or something crazy like that. And it's just like which wasn't in the original game, and it's people just like this. They've just ruined it. They've gone too far with certain things. There's other things in it that were just a bit ridiculous, but
I mean, Metal Gear is known for being like the most serious anime type game out there. It is borderline anime with some of the stuff that happens. You're fighting a vampire at some point or something. Anyway,
wow.
Psychic stuff. But yeah, so I think it. Of course, he's going to say this. Sega was taking the right route in thinking that it should have stayed 2D because the 2D games were very strong on their console. But PS1, the PlayStation 1 was ready for 3D and they put out, and it was easier to develop for. So naturally, they looked better on that console. I think that 3D games, I think they would have been okay in that era if they had just waited a little longer and tried to experiment more with 2D than jumping as soon into 3D as they did. Because by the time the early PS2 and Dreamcast games, some of them don't look good, but like I said with Soul Calibur, that looked just fine. I'm trying to think of other early Dreamcast games. Like Outrigger was a very good arcade port. A lot of good arcade ports. Rival Schools is not called that. Project Justice. There was good 3D stuff on there. But yeah, that era was when they were ready for stuff. Or just simply look at the Sega, the Shenmue demo on Saturn versus what it ended up being on Dreamcast. Like that console was not ready for what they were going to try to pull off with that. So I think that essentially, what's that?
I was just saying, I think that's a great example of like what you saw with Shenmue when it was on the Saturn, and then ultimately, what it became. It's just obviously if they had continued down development, it would have looked better than that, animation that we saw in the Saturn one. But still, like, how much better would it have really been able to look? It wasn't ready to fulfill, I think, his vision of what Shenmue was.
Yeah, I think. Excuse me, sorry. I think 3D, it's okay that it came out this era, but I think they tried too soon with it. And a prime example is if you look at the first Siphon Filter game. That game is bad looking. You are playing as cardboard people in it. Yeah. So I guess I don't.
Oh, go ahead.
My last final closing statement is I don't 100% agree with Chris saying that it just should not have been done on that era, but I think it did happen too soon in that era.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll say I agree. I definitely agree. Like the 2.5D stuff was really good. Like I think that's probably where they should have really started leaning into. But from going from like, all 2D or like quasi 2D with some games and before it, and then just jumping into straight 3D, I think there was just such a huge jump in everything that I just don't think the whole industry was kind of ready for that yet. But so yeah, I think you had a good point with the 2.5D gaming. There was for sure some really good stuff there.
Okay, so my opinion is I think it was not too early for 3D graphics, and here's why. See, I feel like at this time, the Saturn and PlayStation needed to adopt 3D graphics to really push forward with the industry, as it were, because up until this point, the PC had been dabbling in 3D graphics in certain games, stuff that wasn't available on consoles, and before this point in time, games were console things. Like PCs did play games, but it wasn't really a thing that people would really buy a PC to play games. They'd buy a PC to do work on or, school stuff, whatever. But games were like a little side thing. However, this was around the point that the PC started to get better and better and better and were actually pushing better visuals. And suddenly you soon found that, oh, wait a second, PC graphics and stuff are better than these consoles. Arcade systems are gradually brought that up, Scotty. They were getting more and more into 3D. You had games like Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter coming out, all this really good 3D graphics and stuff. And as I mentioned before, the Saturn and PlayStation weren't the first consoles to really dabble in 3D. You had the Philips CDI, which had a handful of games that started to use 3D graphics. Panasonic 3DO had a few more games that actually had 3D graphics in them. Atari Jaguar was using 3D graphics in quite a few of its games. Even the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive had some games in it which actually were using 3D polygons, like Star Fox, like Virtual Racing, for example. Like those consoles, yeah, they're not known for 3D, but they were dabbling in them. They're starting to do that.
Yeah.
And we're at this point in time. We're at this point in time where the industry was moving in that direction. And I think if the Saturn and PlayStation, if Sony and Sega both said, we're going to stick with 2D, we're just going to ignore the 3D, we might do a couple more Star Fox style things, but we're going to stick with 2D. I think at that point, the PC gaming scene would have probably exploded even more. And people would be like, whoa, why are we doing this when PC can do all this cool stuff? And I feel like they needed that. And also arcades as well. Like the Saturn was introducing arcade experiences into your home. Like Sega Rally I know Sega Rally is not the perfect port from the arcade visually, but it's the gameplay and everything of it's brilliant, and it does actually look good for its time. I would admit, not every obviously the Saturn technology wasn't really there properly for 3D compared to PlayStation, so a lot of Saturn games do look a bit ropey. But I feel like them dabbling in it, like with Clockwork Knight, introducing the 3D elements into it, the Panzer Dragoon games, as you say, I think they actually play really well. And I know they look a bit muddy now, but I actually still enjoy the look of those games, the aesthetics. So I feel like they needed to do this because there are 3 consoles just before it which were dabbling in it. They were showing that it could be done. PC games were getting more and more into 3D, and like games like Doom and stuff, which was proving to be hugely popular. You couldn't really play them on these consoles which couldn't do 3D visuals. You needed the PlayStation or the Saturn, which could do 3D. I will admit the Doom version of Saturn is the worst port ever.
Oh, it's the worst.
It's so bad. It's so bad. But then proved themselves, proved the Saturn could handle 3D with Quake. Have you played the Sega Saturn version of Quake?
No, I really want. This is actually
brilliant.
Anti-Chris's. He lent it to me because I mentioned how big of a OG Doom fan I am. Because I have this, and I have behind me the Game Boy Advance version of Doom. Which runs better than this dumb thing. This is so bad. Like I was streaming it for fun when Doom Eternal came out, and I forget, there's a part in one of the levels where you're going across a bridge and there's platforms on the sides, and you can definitely make it to those things to get to other areas. And I had to, like, people were like, you can do that, you can do that. I'm like, okay, let me show you, because I had my camera on me. Like I had the controller and I was showing them in real time how I turn or how I hit the D-pad and how fast I actually turn. I'm like, I cannot do this in this game. You know,
it was so bad. But the version of Quake on the Saturn was brilliant. It actually did better lighting effects than the PC original. It was really good what they did with that.
What was because they did Quake and they did another game where it's like an Egyptian.
Exhumed.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, Exhumed. Oh no, it's called something different. It's called something different in America. It's called Power something, I think.
I'll look it up. Keep talking though.
Okay.
But what I was going to add to it was that those are decent games and unfortunately pricey.
But where was I? So like the PC was starting to do this, and I feel like this is the era that started the PC master race effectively, as they, that common saying, that, games that were coming out on both the Saturn and the PlayStation, if they came out on the PC just looked better, partly because these games were built on PCs, and the graphics cards they were using were sort of designed for that. And as I say, I feel like the Saturn was introducing these 3D arcade experiences into home, which I think would be lost without this era, like Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop, Virtual On, House of the Dead, Sega Touring Cars. There's so many games out there. And as I say, the Saturn's not the best example of 3D visuals, but it did help bring those games to the home. And I feel like it helped Sega and also Sony with those stepping stones for the Dreamcast, for the PlayStation 2. And I would say this, Chris, even if I thought the Saturn and PlayStation weren't the right time, I feel like the N64 was the right time, because Mario 64, I still think looks great today for its time, especially. Like, I feel like, you see, you've got this weird thing about the N64 looking terrible, but I feel like all the visuals in Mario 64 were solid. Like, on the Saturn and on the PlayStation, there oftentimes you'd see like a character, like their 3D formation would be there. Even if they're standing still, it's like kind of weirdly moving in a weird way as the polygons sort of move. That never happened on the N64. Like Mario 64, the launch title for the game, the console, was beautiful. It was perfect. Everything was solid about that game. And I feel like that would have been, if the Saturn and PlayStation, the 32-bit era wasn't right, the 64-bit N64 era was right. I feel like that is the point where, and like, especially for first-person shooters, like I feel like there's a few on the Saturn and PlayStation which were good games, but I feel like first-person shooters really hit home on consoles on the N64 with the likes of GoldenEye and Perfect Dark and Turok. Those were like PC quality first-person shooters on a console, and it was so good, so much fun. So yeah, personally, I feel like this was the era for 3D. They needed that stepping stone because I fear without that, Dreamcast games, PlayStation 2 games wouldn't have looked as good as they did when they were first launched. They needed that stepping stone to build up their quality, the ability to actually do all that 3D, processes, development, whatever. Build that skill set, as it were. You need that stepping stone. So yeah.
I can't find the name of that game, and it's driving me nuts.
It's called like, if you just type in Exhumed, SEGA Saturn, it'll probably come up with the other title.
All right.
SEGA.
Probably. Yeah, Power Slave.
Power Slave, there we go. You had power in it. Okay, so we've each said our pieces and opinions. Do we have any rebuttal? Do we agree with any of each other's views on these things? Or are we all, solidly sticking to our guns and thinking, no, we're right?
I'll just say, like, I will say I think Scotty had a good point about the 2.5D gaming. So I would be happy with having that transition going, during this time frame of like maybe in the beginning of this console generation, it was more 2D gaming with it going into 2.5D, and then maybe towards the end, maybe dabbling in some 3D stuff. That way, when you really did get to the PS2 era, the developers were more ready to make that transition.
Okay, so here's actually, no, Scotty, you go ahead first. You go ahead first.
Well, I was going to say, to support my idea that I don't think they should have been entirely left for dead in that series or in that era. Gex Out of the Gecko is a really solid 3D platformer, and that was out later on. Another good 3D type game, the Virtual On game, which just rough to look at, but it was cool that was on the Saturn. I'm trying to find out. And then something that Graham reminded me of, the 32X actually had some of the first like arcade ports from Sega.
Oh yeah.
That, like the Star Wars game's pretty good. Virtual Racing on there is very close to the arcade port. And actually Doom on the 32X is better than the Saturn version of Doom. And here we go. If 32X lasted only slightly longer, then maybe they would have been ready for the Saturn's hardware. And you can make a picture of me with that ball of yarn chart on the top of the wall. It says like, if the 32X lasted longer or something, because I'm going to die on that hill that it would have helped Sega if they had released it later and maybe developed it better. Because there are some gems on the 32X.
There are.
But I can't remember. Sketchcraft said that it's like you're playing The Last Starfighter. What was that other game on the 32X?
I love that game. Yeah, I can't remember what it's called. I never remember what it's called.
It was Shadow Squadron, I think.
That's the one. Yeah.
So there were like, it seemed, maybe it's because they were more familiar with the Genesis hardware, but that the 32X games, some of them, it had potential. It's weird to say that. It's weird to even support the 32X in 2020. But the more I learned about it, the more I wish that it had a better chance, because I think that could have been the stopgap to get to the Saturn if they had if they hadn't released the Sega CD or something. I mean, this is alternate history to the nth degree now. But what I'm saying is, if the 32X had a longer life cycle, that maybe the Saturn would have been ready for 3D gaming. From the get-go.
That's fair. Yeah, that's a fair comment, maybe. I have to ask this question, though. So, Chris, Scotty, if we were to say that, Sega and Sony didn't go with 3D for this particular era, do you think we would have missed out on some really great titles? Like, you've got Knights, you've got Panzer Dragoon Zwei, Panzer Dragoon Saga, you've got Spyro the Dragon on the PlayStation, like Crash Bandicoot. I hate that game, but I know people love it. Yeah, all those games. Final Fantasy. You got the Final Fantasy 7 on the PlayStation 1, which was like the system killer. That's got
look how it looks now, though. It looks like crap.
But at the time, people were like, "Oh my god, this is amazing." I mean, if you look at like Xbox original games, people were like, "Oh, that looks crap now." At the time, you're like, "Whoa!" Like Sega Rally for me at the time was like, "I'm in a real racing game right now. This is freaking awesome." And then now I'm like, "Oh, it doesn't look that good." But at the time, you're like, "Wow, this is the best graphics I've ever seen." So yeah, do you think we would have missed out on those games? Do you think this alternate history would have missed out those gems of that era? Because I feel like those were some of the games that were very much of that era. I know there have been Crash Bandicoot games since and Spyro games since, but at the time, that was something about those games that was just, wow, it was beautiful for that era. It was perfect. It's so good. And I'm going to say it hand on heart, I don't think they've made a better 3D Mario game since Mario 64. I think that's the best 3D Mario game ever. I'm sorry. Mario Odyssey, I just don't get. I think it's fine, not great. Sunshine sucked.
Let's not get into that.
Okay, anyway, yeah. But I feel like of its time, those were games that really launched. I don't know. Those are the 3D games I thought worked so well.
I don't think Final Fantasy VII can support that argument because it's not a fully 3D game.
Let's skip that. Let's cut that out. Cut that out. Ignore that. I was trying to think of PlayStation games that are popular.
What I'm saying is, though, that game did well, or I think it's aged okay because you have the pre-rendered stuff. And then the battles are 3D, but that's not a full part of the game. Like, if they tried to make that full game 3D, it'd be a pile of crap. And that's what, unfortunately, they try to do with other stuff. Like, I think if they were ready for 3D, if Sega was ready for 3D, then Sonic Extreme would have happened. Sonic Extreme did not come out, and it's probably good that it didn't, after seeing like what Sonic Jam Sonic World was and Sonic R was.
I love Sonic Jam
3D
Sonic World.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I love Sonic World. I'm saying that, like look at Sonic 3D Blast. That's not a 3D game. It's not 3D at all. That's all pre-rendered isometric junk. So I don't know where I was going. I was just going with this, where it's like FF7 is not a defense on 3D.
Okay,
should have happened.
Ignore that comment. I was literally trying to pull out popular PlayStation titles out of my head. I couldn't really think of any. Gran Turismo. Yeah. There we go. Gran Turismo, 3D racing game. Like basically launched people into loving realistic racing games. I don't know. Do you think we'd have missed out on those games?
Yeah, which is weird to think about.
Because I feel like if it
would have happened, we wouldn't have missed out on them, for one, and they wouldn't have happened until they probably would. Those games would have happened eventually, but maybe they would have been on the PS2 or the Xbox 360.
But do you not? Okay, so there's for the Saturn. Let's give the Saturn as a prime example here. There are games that were ported from the arcade to the Saturn, which I think are part of my gaming experience, my gaming history. I grew up with them. I love them. Like Sega Rally and Virtua Fighter, for example. If Sega skipped the 3D era for that time, for like those, so the Saturn came out in, like, was it 94? It ended about 98, 99. That's like 4 or 5 years. It had gone to the Dreamcast. That's too late for those games to be released. We'd never seen Sega Rally on a console. Maybe Sega Rally 2 would have come out, because it did come out on the Dreamcast, but I feel like I would have missed out on some beautiful games. Like, I still think Sega Rally today is still one of my favorite racing games.
They still would have released them.
I don't know. I don't know if they would have. Like, that's too old. That you don't really see old retro arcade games coming out on new systems. It's very rare to see.
I would have missed Virtua Cop. That would have been. That was a big part of my childhood.
The light gun games were prime in that era. Like, yeah, you got Time Crisis, you got Virtua Cop, you got House of the Dead. House of the Dead was one of my favorite shooters of all time. On the Dreamcast, you had a few. Xbox, you had a couple. PlayStation had a few, but then that kind of died a death. After that era, there's no more. Like, because it just really, we had a few, but the technology of TVs moved on that you couldn't really use light guns anymore, so it's kind of all redundant. I just feel this. I feel it'd be okay. You're right, Chris. We wouldn't miss it because we wouldn't know about it, but I feel like that would be a shame. Almost, I feel like we got a good version of history here. I don't know. I'm going to defend this to the death. I agree the technology on those systems wasn't the best, but I feel like they needed that stepping stone to start to bring out these brilliant games. The
beginning of anything looks horrible. Look at the first iPod.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With a physical click wheel and crap. So it's I think I understand where Chris is coming from for sure. But I stand firm that I think it still was okay to start in that era, but not launching the era.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that Sega reacted to release 3D games when they found out Sony was making a 3D system?
100%, because the Saturn was not made for that.
Yeah, because that's the one thing that always bugged me about the Saturn. They didn't really make it. They made it so it could do 3D, but it wasn't really designed perfectly for 3D. So yeah, it's a shame.
I think that's my closing statement, though, is like that era was okay for it, but it was the learning era, and I think the Dreamcast era would not be as fondly remembered if we hadn't led. You got to put out some garbage before you put out the good stuff.
And I feel like if we didn't have that era, I would have missed out on my favorite game of all time, Panzer Dragoon Saga. So if there's an alternative reality you're going to create, Chris, I want to stay in this one. I will die here. I'll die happy. It's fine. You guys continue. You go into the future. I'll stay here. Panzer Dragoon Saga. Any further thoughts, Chris? Sorry.
Muted.
You are muted right now.
You're muted.
I was just saying I have no more thoughts.
People at home, viewers, listeners, however you're watching or listening to this, let us know your thoughts. Do you agree with Chris? Do you agree with Scotty, who's kind of in the middle? Or do you agree with me, which would be great because, I'm normally wrong about this stuff. So let us know your thoughts. Who's right? Can you see that alternate reality, that alternate time of history? Or do you think they could have been done differently? Just let us know. It would be great. And I guess with that wraps up the show for this week. Has anyone got any final thoughts for the whole show? You all good?
All your opinions are wrong, Graham.
Perfect.
Yep.
Love it. All your base belong to us. Anyway, for that, take it easy, everybody. And be excellent to each other.
See ya.